back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. My next guest has written a book that dives right into one of the hot topics on the left, including the extremely online left, the partly online left, and the sometimes online left. Ben Burgis, I always enjoy talking to him, is a philosophy instructor at Georgia State University Perimeter College. He is a Jacobin columnist, which is where I first encountered his writing. He's the host of Give Them an Argument podcast. I enjoyed my conversation with him there. And he has a new book that I just finished reading that I highly recommend and really enjoyed, entitled Canceling Comedians While the World Burns, a critique of the contemporary left. So without any further ado, Ben Burgis, welcome back to the program.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Richard.
Oh, always a pleasure. And I'll give you like 30 seconds to briefly lay out the theme of the book.
All right.
Or 60 if you want
to. Okay, all right. I can do 60. Yeah, the book is basically about a lot of ways in which it seems to me that the left is screwed up, and that we should do better. And I think that this is often a touchy thing. I remember the late Michael Brooks had a good line about how oftentimes people have an attitude towards criticisms like this. It's almost like if you had a basketball coach who made his team do drills, and you said, "Oh, he must be against the team," that any sort of criticism from any direction is kind of conflated, whether it's a criticism from the right, from people who oppose the left's goals and are criticizing because of that, or from someone like me who supports the left's goals and is as such concerned that we have various ways of doing things, that we have bad habits that are going to stop us, or at least make it more difficult for us to achieve those goals. And that's what the book is really about.
Yeah, I totally get that, and I struggle with this myself. Because, of course, we all do, right? Because if we're involved in leftist dialogue, debate, interactions, in any way, I feel we've come across this sort of drawing of lines that says, if you're not with me, you're against me, and if you criticize me, you're not with me.
Right.
And that's, I know you say in your introduction that your editors asked you at the end of the process, would you be willing, or the pitching process, I guess, would you be willing to take the heat? And the fact that question needs to be asked is, in and of itself, evocative to me of what's going on here. And so basically, your premise, as I have read the book, is we're worrying about the wrong things. We make ourselves look bad by focusing on these relatively minor things. And obviously, I'm going to leave a lot out, and we'll talk about it. But that we alienate the undecided, that we should be reaching out to with some of these puristic attacks, and that they are, in effect, the ineffectual gestures of a movement that assumes it is powerless and will always be powerless, as opposed to a movement that seeks power in order to do good and is prepared for power and does not focus on every minor distraction along the way. Is that a fair summary, you think?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. So, in the book, I talk about a lot of things that I think are related to each other, kind of cluster of left pathologies that involves everything from hysteria about extremely minor political differences to a willingness to think the worst of people based on very little evidence, and to a sort of perverse fascination with some of the least honorable parts of socialist history, and trying to rehabilitate them. And what I think all of these things have in common is that they're what I think of as pathologies of powerlessness, that the left has been wandering in the desert for so very long, certainly at least in the countries I'm most familiar with, like the United States and the UK, in a more complicated way, maybe elsewhere, that even people like Bernie Sanders or Jeremy Corbyn, who I think of as like good, honorable left social democrats, spent the overwhelming majority of their careers as extremely marginal backbenchers, up until the last few years, when the door of political possibilities started to open a little bit. And certainly anything more radical than that was completely off the table. So Mark Fisher, somebody I talk about a lot in the book,
Right.
has this concept of capitalist realism, which is not necessarily the same thing as enthusiasm about capitalism, thinking that capitalism is wonderful. It's more just a sense of reality that is thoroughly informed by the victory of capitalism. So sure, you might not like it. There might be lots of things that you hate about it, but ultimately it's like complaining about the weather. What are you going to do? It's just inevitable. And in this kind of frigid political environment that the left has had to exist in until extremely recently, when it's finally started to change a little bit, it was natural, I think, that we tended to see the left project not as a real project to try to change the material world, but essentially as a symbolic form of protest against the many injustices of capitalism and imperialism and police violence and all of these things. So that, for example, to pick on somebody who I really like, Noam Chomsky, who I've always deeply admired. As my friend Daniel Bester points out, there's never going to be a place, and you read Chomsky, where like on page 93 or something, he says, well, if a socialist government took power, here's how we would handle this situation. Right. And I understand why not, because for most of the time that he's writing, that would feel like saying, oh, when I'm enthroned as the emperor of the galaxy, here's what I'll do.
Right.
But the problem is that when you essentially see politics as a symbolic protest, as a kind of symbolic display of your own moral commitment, rather than a serious attempt to win over others so you can change the world, then you do a lot of things that are incredibly counterproductive if your goal was to actually change the world. You start, and one of the things, it's not the only thing, but one of the things the book is about the way that often shades into interrogating obsessively the moral commitment of others. Well, they say they agree with me, but do they really agree with me? What about this take that they have on one particular issue? What about this thing that they tweeted in 2017? And I think that with that, as well as with the rest of what I'm talking about in the book, I think on all of these issues, there are principled arguments for not acting this way. But what I'm primarily concerned with in the book is the strategic argument, because I think that this stuff is just poisonous for the project of building a left that could become a movement not just for the working class, but of the working class.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It's as if we, as a movement, skipped the popular front period and the acquiring power period and went straight to the show trials, without having any power. And it's you're Bulgakov, or whoever, It's like there's no, and to me that says a lot about a certain personality traits, and the fact that, as you mentioned, the left, because it has an envisioned power, is often performative. And I would say it's also often an interior exercise. It's a psychological, it's how I see myself. It's how I want to, imagine myself. And while I have compassion for anybody who wants to imagine themselves as other than they are, or not being grounded in the real world, I think that comes out of genuine alienation and pain. It's not a good way to build a movement. And it seems to me, Ben, that since I did bring up, maybe I'll start with this: the psychological, the kind of, I hesitate to use this word, but this kind of the spiritual heart of the book to me was when you quote Nietzsche.
Yeah.
And he says, in effect, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, that something even worse than Christianity is coming, right? And you theorize that at least Christianity says, love the sin and hate the sinner. I mean, I'm sorry, love the sinner is Freudian slip.
Yeah.
Love this. There's some pretty lovable sins, but
Sure.
love the sinner, hate the sin. And to me, you theorize, well, maybe the something worse is they don't even love the sinner now. They just hate the sinner and the sin. And to which I would only add, Christianity at least held out the possibility of human redemption. And we've discarded that. You say one inappropriate thing in 2012, that defines you for the rest of your life.
Yeah, exactly. That, I mean, as much as there are many Christian leftists who I admire. I mentioned Cornel West in the book. My wife Jennifer Burgis is another one. But
Harry Eagleton's not bad.
Yeah, absolutely. But I'm an atheist. I read Nietzsche on Christianity. There's a lot that I'm not along with. But when you get to that claim, about something worse, and certainly when you see like Mark Fisher saying about what he calls the vampire's castle, which is the sort of culture of counterproductive left moralism, here it is, then you could reasonably say, okay, you're being too dramatic, because look at the worst of what Christianity has done, from the Spanish Inquisition to
Inquisition was pretty bad. Right.
It doesn't clearly, yelling at people on Twitter or trying to get them fired doesn't hold a candle to that. Right. And similarly, somebody could say, look, we've got show trials, but since we don't have any power at the end of the trial, nobody's being let out to the firing squad. And I think that that's all fair to a certain extent. But I'd say a couple things about it. So one of them is that it's actually, even though, of course, I think psychological harms are real harms, and the people and the very people who in this context would say that they're not, in many other contexts, that psychological harms are real harms. When they're talking about like sexist harassment, for example, online, they absolutely think psychological harms are real harms, but somehow 1,000 strangers, screaming at you that you're a racist and a fascist, because of like some lone tweet that's been misinterpreted, is not a real harm. I think that's an untenable contradiction. But then the other is what you mentioned, which is that, okay, there are lots of senses in which the track record of Christianity is much worse, but at least in Christianity, there is this stated belief in loving the sinner. At least in Christianity, there is the possibility of redemption. And all too often in these contexts, I don't see any indication of either of those things. I mean, whatever the hypocrisies there might be in the claim to hate the sin but love the sinner, I'll take that over the sinner is literal trash, and so are you if you defend him, which is often what I see on left Twitter. And the possibility of redemption, I'm really glad that you raised that, because this is really disturbing to me, both in itself, just as a way of structure and human interaction, and for the strategic reasons that I'm trying to push in the book. Because I think about things like, for example, Teen Vogue, where people might or might not be familiar who are watching this. Teen Vogue is, weirdly enough, someplace that in the last couple of years has published a lot of really good left-wing political content. like somehow now you open up Teen Vogue and there's stuff about Karl Marx and general strikes. But they recently hired a new editor. This a 27-year-old woman who 10 years before, as a teenager, tweeted some objectionable, sort of trying a little bit too hard to be edgy and shading into mild racism tweets. And she did this as a teenager. She apologized for it numerous times, abjectly. But it was still a huge controversy about hiring her as a woman in her late 20s. And she ended up resigning, which I usually assume in corporate context, like Condé Nast, is a nice way of saying being fired, but we'll save you some of the embarrassment, but at the very least resigned under pressure. And it struck me that people who were calling on her to do so, who really objected to Condé Nast hiring her as the editor of Teen Vogue, that every single one of these people is rightly opposed to mass incarceration, rightly thinks that the American carceral state is far too harsh and punitive, and rightly advocates, for example, the movement to ban the box in employment applications so that people who get out of prison can get regular non-criminal employment. When they get out, their past felony convictions won't be held against them, which again is something I absolutely agree with them about. But it's also a little funny because you think, okay, on the one hand, you want rapists and murderers to eventually have a second shot and be rehabilitated. On the other hand, somebody who had bad tweets as a teenager should be forever tarnished by this. Or I think about Cenk Uygur from the Young Turks, who is somebody who, there are criticisms of him I might agree with. His politics are not exactly my politics, but he's somebody who founded that network. He was instrumental in founding Justice Democrats, which is the organization that bears the lion's share of the responsibility for electing AOC and all those people to Congress. And earlier in his life, he wasn't always a progressive. He used to be a conservative. And as a young conservative, he had a blog where, as conservatives are prone to do, he said some stupid shit. And in some sort of swaggering, macho, sexist things, that he wrote in these blog posts as a young conservative. And in the time in between, we're talking about literally, I think, something like 20 years at this point between those blog posts and now, he moved so far to the left that he started the Young Turks and Justice Democrats. He completely changed his views about everything. And he also, many times over the course of those 20 years, apologized for what he'd written in those ancient blog posts. But once every several years, when people are mad at him for one reason or another, people seem to dredge them back up. So it happened a few years ago, and he had to step down from his position at Justice Democrats. It happened last year when he was running for Congress as a Bernie-crat kind of primary challenger, and he went from being endorsed by Sanders himself to and a lot of other people to not being endorsed by anybody. There's some he said, she said about exactly what happened there. That doesn't really concern me here, but I think what does is, one, on a human level, not believing in the possibility of redemption bothers me. Two, on a strategic level, what kind of message does this send that to all the people who currently disagree with us, which sometimes I feel like my friends and comrades on the left aren't always tracking this, but people who disagree with us, that's a category that includes most people.
Far and away. I mean, let's be real. And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Well, no, I was just going to say, I mean, like, the message it sends to people who disagree with us is, even if you come around, even if we convince you and you start agreeing with us, then we will still reserve the right to hold against you until the end of time, anytime it's convenient, the fact that at one time you disagreed with us and you had bad positions and said bad things. I don't know who would want to join a club that sent that message.
Well, there are so many interesting issues that branch out from this one, Ben Burgis, and one of them that I don't want to overlook is comedy itself.
Yeah.
Because comedy function, some people say, well, what are you worried about? Seinfeld complains about, college crowds don't laugh at his crap anymore. And,
Right.
he's got $1 billion. Why are you weeping for Jerry Seinfeld about? Well, first of all, it's not necessarily about Jerry Seinfeld. In this case, it's certainly not. As you say, tactically, strategically, it's about, he's got a gazillion fans. It's about what do they think of you? But also, it's, and I applaud you for not quoting Henri Bergson once, his essay on laughter, his book on laughter. But, there is, in fact, comedy laughs through shock, it elicits laughs through shock, through surprise, through violating the norms of human communication, and even to a certain extent decency. I mean, you quote a Dave Chappelle joke that is not only like objectively horrible, but involves like members of my extended family, which is the molestation conducted by Michael Jackson of children, or accused of conducting. Well, I blame the victims. What were they wearing? I mean,
Right.
I have to admit, I laughed out loud when I read that.
Of course.
And it's funny,
Yeah.
And so if you want to cancel Dave Chappelle over that, number one, you don't get what comedy is, right? Because Dave Chappelle is not, I would venture to argue, endorsing the molestation.
No.
Right. And, two, yeah, look, I've been on this planet a long time. Sometimes I hear the jokes I heard as a kid and laughed at, because my father was a former vaudevillian magician. So he used to quote all these guys. And my mother had banned Henny Youngman because at some get-together in 1947, he told a racist joke, and she would have nothing to do with Henry, to her credit, to Henny Youngman for the rest of her life. But I think back to some of these jokes that I thought were funny as a kid. They're horrible. They're offensive. They're not funny. But because norms have changed, and that's okay. But to say I'm going to ban Sarah Silverman because she made a joke in 2008 that we've evolved past accepting now is just nuts, And why does it matter? It doesn't matter because Sarah Silverman won't be okay. She'll be okay. But it matters because, one, tactically and strategically, as you say, it's a bad idea. And two, when we encourage that, we are nurturing, in my view, some of the worst aspects of ourselves, which is the craving to judge, to condemn, to be judge, jury, and executioner on a social level. Am I taking it too far?
No, I think that's exactly right. So, in that opening chapter about the comedy wars, of course, ultimately, where I'm going with it in the book is as you indicated about this sort of the role that the left wants to have, the image it wants to project of itself, and how all that plays in the wider world. But I do also weigh in on the issue itself, and I think that the culture wars are really bad for comedy, just on that human level that you're talking about. That the way that good comedy often works is that it makes our inner lives more interesting by making us very, very uncomfortable. Which is not unlike the way the good literature works, for example. I don't want to be too pretentious about that, but I mean, I think that is often its function. So I mentioned in the book, for example, my friend David Feldman, who is a podcaster, which is how I primarily know him. But he's also has a long career as a stand-up and as a comedy writer. He wrote for The Daily Show, for Bill Maher, so who I don't think is particularly funny, but you can probably attribute his good lines to David Feldman.
Yeah.
Triumph, The Insult Comic Dog, etc. And one of the things I'm sure it loses something in my retelling, but one of the things I always think of as a perfect, David Feldman line came in a very unfunny context. When he was interviewing me and we were talking about a synagogue shooting, and it probably says something about how many mass shootings and hate crimes have happened in the last several years. That I honestly don't remember which one, because I know there are a few of those in the last couple of years. But how what the solution would be, whether we should talk about gun control, etc. And he said, look, I know anti-Semitism will always exist. And then he has his perfectly timed comic pause, and then he finishes, as long as I do this show.
I laughed at that too. It's like, and by the way, you mentioned George Carlin.
Yeah.
And you also mentioned, like, on the other side, politically correct comedians like Sandra Bee. I had to sit through an evening event where Sandra Bee, which was one of the longest nights of my life. She is not, you are correct, she is not funny. But I went to a club in Hermosa Beach or somewhere with a comedian friend where comedians test out their material. And George Carlin was workshopping his last HBO special. And the material he did in the club was much better than the special itself, because I watched the special. But he had a whole bit about, we condemn Middle Eastern people who turn to terrorism. If X, Y, and Z happened in your neighborhood, like happens in your neighborhood, you'd be on the roof with an Uzi and I'd be right next to you. And that's the power of comedy, to also challenge, make, I don't want to be pretentious either, but to make, kind of conceptual breakthrough for the audience. That was a nervy thing for Carlin to do, and I think the HBO probably told him to take it out, but that is also, a value, that.
Yeah, it could help us. I think like any form of art, it can help you see the world the way that the artist sees it, and not the way that you're used to seeing it. And there could be some real value in that. Like, I think in that Carlin line that you're counting there, it can maybe help somebody, in that moment, like see something that you're just not really supposed to see in the context of the sort of patriotic fervor of the war on terror.
Can I just add a couple of things, Ben, even though we're talking about your book, so it doesn't seem fair. One is, I saw the producers in a movie theater with my family when I was like 13. And what made it incredibly funny back in whatever it was, 1968, was that was as transgressive as your friend's anti-Semitism joke. That was only 15, 20 years after the Holocaust. You did not joke about anything to do with it.
Much less do the, like, dancing, springtime for
dancing, singing Hitler's to the left, dancing Hitler's to the right. That stuff was partially hilarious because it was so outrageous. Plot, plot, plot. That's all you do, you big dictator. That stuff was really that the movie didn't do well because it was originally, because it was too shocking. And so to me, that is huge. And I just also, before we go any further, I want to thank you for mentioning the whole John Oliver calling Trump Drumpf. And how everybody thought that was hilarious. I wrote about it at the time and got a lot of crap for it, pointing out, among other things, A, that it's not only not funny, but B, it's actually the very kind of European ethnocentric Anglo-Saxon snobbery you pretend to condemn. You're mocking the guy because his name was originally foreign sounding. Right. What a good leftist you are.
Yeah, and I think that incident is really revealing of a larger problem, because even though I do think that, as with the Carlin line that you mentioned, I think sometimes there can be some direct political utility because people can see things at a certain angle, they wouldn't otherwise see it. I think that comedy is like probably. And I'm not against mixing comedy and political commentary. Certainly, I've mentioned Michael Brooks already in this, and he was the all-time master at that. So I think that can be good. But if we're just talking about comedy in itself, comedy as a form, I think that it's something that the more sort of unambiguous where you're going with it is, the less value it actually generally has in sort of making our inner lives more complicated by making us uncomfortable the way we were talking about, because that's not really what it's for. I think that if you say, okay, here is the well-defined conclusion, and here's exactly how it connects with what I'm saying, then you're not doing a stand-up bit. You're writing an essay and then maybe like put in some laugh lines in it, and so I think that it's sort of best on a human level when it is when oftentimes it is ambiguous, when like that Dave Chappelle special that you mentioned earlier, humor is being milked from the sort of contradictions and ambiguities on the edge of difficult issues. Not that child molestation is a difficult issue. That's just wrong. But I think other jokes in that special. Yeah. And I think that oftentimes this idea that comedy should be playing a more direct political role than it is what's behind the moralistic outrage that sometimes is directed at somebody like Dave Chappelle or Bill Burr, because of the content of their sets, because it's only against the expectation that there's going to be some really important political role that comedy is going to play that it makes sense to react to Dave Chappelle sort of working out his ambiguous thoughts about hot button social issues as if it were a manifesto. And I think that expectation that it's going to play that kind of role has to do with this conception of how politics works. That's kind of all about like speaking truth to power. That you're going to sort of announce the forbidden truths, and then everybody's eyes are going to be opened by it. And that Trump thing is a perfect example, because the way that so many liberals got so excited about the Trump thing and shared it with each other and spread it everywhere, it was like they thought that was it. We got him now.
That's true, actually. That was the reaction, whereas a lot of people might have thought that Trump was funnier than John Oliver, actually, at that point.
Trump is funnier.
He is funnier. Yeah, he's
John Oliver. I mean, he's a monster, but he is both a monster and actually a fairly talented insult comic, in certain contexts. I mean, I remember when one of those early Republican debates when Jeb Bush was waxing indignant about how so first I remember Trump pointed out that Jeb's brother had clearly not kept us safe in the way that Jeb was saying that that he did, but then Jeb was waxing indignant about Trump going after his family, and he was talking about how amazing his mother Barbara Bush was, and he was sort of trying to get those moral points for saying that, and just the way that like with perfect timing Trump interjects, maybe she should run for president, like it is actually funny.
Yeah, and I'm not going to say he's a comic genius of all time, but what Trump had, and then this leads into the next topic I wanted to raise, but what Trump had that made him both politically effective and at times funny, and your example is a perfect reflection of that, is he broke the proscenium and he defied expectations I'm now being tautological in unexpected ways. You know, I remember, you know, as a former speechwriter, I mean, I was in awe of that. You know, I remember sitting in like, you know, with pizza and a bunch of political people watching those Republican debates here in D.C. And I was just like, this guy's like breaking the proscenium. He's talking directly to the audience. He's violating all the norms of political speech. He's talking over them. He's addressing the interlocutor. He's going, you know, I mean, it was an amazing, almost concept art, right? It was performance art.
Yeah, I mean, an analogy I thought of a lot of times. You remember that movie Bullworth?
Sure. No, there was a Bullworth quality to it. Great comparison. And to me, what that gets to, and the point I wanted to raise, is that great comedy performance, like great music performance, socially binds people who might not otherwise bond. So, I mean, I remember listening to Howard Tate when he made a comeback, the old R&B singer, and one of the opening figure to his most famous, such as it was, song, Get It While You Can, played. You know, the guy across the table from me, I had no idea who he was. We just fist bumped like that because it was like amazing. This guy who had disappeared for 30 years, nobody knew where he was back and singing this song. Great comedy does the same thing. You're in a crowd with people, you laugh at something you didn't see coming. And that, by definition, is trans-ideological. It's right. You don't take a position test. You're not ideologically screened for that. It's just I'm sitting next to you and you're sitting next to somebody else. And the comedy piece I did see recently that I thought was really good and reflected that was the Black Jeopardy with Tom Hanks. You know, where it's like, you know, it reflected a certain commonality, and I imagine both audiences laughed at it. But in general, to try to punish people for attempting to break those barriers of division, it's not only strategically bad, as you say, but it's kind of, I consider it more reflective of a moral failing, which is a failure to see my common humanity with that of people who think differently than me.
Yeah, and I
am I being too harsh or too?
Yeah, I like that you raised that because that's something that is a reaction that I get every now and again when I criticize left moralism, which is a word that's used a lot in the book. You know, moralistic, and sometimes that's received as like, oh, what are you objecting to? Morality, you know, doing the right thing. And I make a distinction there. And so I think that, of course, any kind of, of political analysis or, political activity ultimately arises out of some kind of moral impulse. There's some conception you have of how you think society should be, and that you're committed to, that you have some some normative preferences about what you think should happen. But moralism is, to my mind, something much more specific than that, which is a specific kind of moral preoccupation with individual moral character, and kind of standing in judgment of it. And I think not only is moralism not the same thing as morality, because after all, just sort of trying to change the world is itself a moral impulse to have better institutions. And as I spend so much time arguing in the book, to the extent that the left look like overgrown hall monitors, that alienates the people we need to win over for that.
Right, project. Of course. Yeah.
And then but also there is a kind of deeper reason that's not something I focus on in the book, but I think is also true that you're raising, which is that moralism is itself morally objectionable.
Correct. Exactly. Yeah. I'm sorry to
yeah. But because it's something. Because look, going back to the point about Nietzsche, forgiveness and redemption are also moral impulses, and it's also And also to the extent that you're kind of rushing to judgment about individuals, that you're primarily concerned about having you're holding people accountable, right? This is something that always like gives me the creeps, when I see these phrases being deployed on left Twitter, consequences and accountability, because it's corporate HR speak, but at a spiritual level, the spiritual core of it is a suburban Republican talking about how liberal judges need to stop coddling criminals. This obsession with accountability I think there's a sadistic element to it, and I think that it's something that as you say, I think it can blind us to our common humanity, because if you're telling yourself, oh, I'm not like those other people, they're bad, right? I'm good, then that limits your ability to understand and empathetically identify with other people, and it blinds you to the complexities and ambiguities of life, and all the ways that people can mess up, and all the ways that something that might register to you as people messing up might just be a complexity that you're not really attuned to. And I think that this whole question of art criticism, which is whether we're talking about comedy or anything else, is a place where that really comes out. There's a essay that I really love. I think I must not have read it yet when I wrote the book, or else I certainly would have cited it in the book. Is by Freddie DeBoer. It's from 2017. It was
Planet of Cops, right?
Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah, great essay. Yeah.
And he talks about how we're just entering this moment as a culture, where everybody's a cop. We're all walking the beat 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, in the division of problematics. There's a new movie that everybody loves. Well, don't worry. Give me 3 hours and I'll get you your 800 words, and I'll get you your indictments. And I think that just really captures something about the zeitgeist of this, that if you
say something political, I think he had some sentence, you say something political and they'll be tapping on your windshield with a billy club saying license and registration. It was amazing. And Ben, I there's a lot more we could say about it, but I guess to the people who say, why write a book about canceling comedians, I would say it's a lens into the psyche of large portions of the left, both strategically and how we look at other people. I periodically remind myself of the old song, the question in the old song, and ask myself, what is so funny about peace, love, and understanding? And to me, this reflects the opposite of peace, love, and understanding. This is conflict, hate, judgment, a refusal to understand how somebody who grew up didn't have your privilege, Mr. or Ms. Leftist, of being bathed in the Brooklyn hipster subculture for decades. They grew up somewhere else. They had a different experience. They may not, you may be right, but they may never have had the opportunity to know what you know. So let's just trash them forever, because they didn't know in 2003 what you know in 2021. So let's destroy them. Let's condemn them. Let's ban them. There ain't no peace, love, and understanding in that, and no left is going to win, in my view, without a little taste of understanding. And I guess there's so much more I could say about Adolph Reed, and I'm glad you included him, but and other things. But I mean, that's the gist of it for me, and I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, and I think that last issue that you're kind of raising in the middle of that is an important one, that this kind of ties into the class dynamics of it, which is something that we haven't really talked about, but I think it's an important element, because so many people on the left are, even if they're downwardly mobile, which is maybe part of the reason why they've come to identify with the leftist program, which is a good thing. They're acculturated into a certain kind of professional class way of approaching things. And this sense that you often get that to be a member of the left in good standing, you have to sort of have memorized a handbook of cultural sensibilities, of language that you're supposed to use and not use, of what sort of counts as like an acceptable take on each thing, is really a reflection of that. And I think that you're right to say that there are two issues here that are intertwined, which are just being more, being more human about how you interact with people. The peace, love, and understanding part, and the strategic dimension, because the more you seem like unpleasant scolds who just kind of want to monitor each other for bad behavior, so you can get that self-righteous thrill of denunciation. The less most people who we need to win over are going to want to have anything to do with you, and that's just a huge mistake. It's a huge mistake on principle, and it's a huge mistake strategically because we have a world to win.
Amen. And my last comment, I can't tell you how many people I encounter who are like basically liberal Democrats or socialists or something in the middle who say, I mean, I think it's a bigger deal strategically than a lot of people think too, who really say to me, this canceling and this joylessness is making me sick, and Tucker Carlson is starting to look better to these people every day. So, Ben Burgis, thanks for writing this book. Again, the book is Canceling Comedians While the World Burns, a critique of the contemporary left. As I say, thanks for writing it. And as always, thanks for coming on the program.
All right. Thank you, Richard.
And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.